Welcome to another episode of Living Room Logic, but with a slight twist that we're recording this with video now.
Yes, we are.
We've reinvested some of our stuff into trying to make the podcast as engaging and as wide as possible. And, well, given that there's something big going on at the moment, we thought we'd throw out another episode on climate change because COP26 is going on, which is a world leader summit all about climate change and trying to come to a reasonable understanding as to what, as a global community, we can do to combat climate change. Now, I have no expertise, none at all. I have plenty of fear, plenty of confusion, plenty of...
As we found out in the last episode about climate change.
And I have plenty of ideas which are consistently incorrect. But someone who doesn't not know things, Aidan Long. Dr. Aidan Long, it's so nice to do an episode where we're talking about something we actually understand. And by we, I mean him. So Aidan.
Thank you very much for introducing me. About the person of the two right now who knows what we're talking about.
Yeah. That was my moment. That was my moment to shine.
And you did great. So this whole bonus episode came about because of this new, very important Conference of Parties, COP26, the 26th meeting of all of the world leaders, or most of them in the world, to talk about what's going on, what's going on with climate change. It's all about this really important meeting that's going on, this COP26 meeting. And why they're having this meeting now is because just a couple of months ago, the main body on climate change research called the IPCC, or the International Panel on Climate Change, they came out with this humongous report, couple thousand pages. It is a monster. And we're going to talk about it page by page. No, just kidding.
What? Oh, God.
So the great thing about it is because policymakers don't have the time for that either, to go through this 2,000-3,000 page report. So what the IPCC have done is they've kind of turned this report into just a document that basically shows, Andrew has it on his video as well, this it's like a 40-page document, and I've just taken out the most important key figures and some key facts from it to show us where we are and where we're going. So let's start. Are you ready for this, Andrew?
No, let's go. I am not ready. To be fair, the last climate change episode, I came out a little settled, and I expected to come out very drunk and very upset. So let's go. Let's see if I come out with this more settled than last time.
Yeah, so the way that they do this summary for policymakers is it's broken up into kind of two major sections. It's like the present, so like what has happened so far up to 2021 in terms of climate change. Has the climate already changed? Have we already seen changes? The answer is yes, a lot. And we'll get into that. And then the second part is all about projections of the future. And they have gotten better and better and better. Every single huge report they make. And now they start using these words like unequivocal. And I'll give you some examples and facts of the current state of the climate right now. This is their opening sentence of the report. They basically say, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. So they come out with, this is the first report where they come out with such confidence. Unequivocal has never been used in any of these reports before. It's usually like high likelihood, very high likelihood, stuff like that. Now it's unequivocal, okay? I'm going to give a couple kind of quick shot facts about some of the different things that are going on to do with climate change, and then we'll talk about them, okay?
Yeah.
So, up to date, increases in greenhouse gases since 1750 are unequivocally caused by human activities, which right now we're at 410 parts per million for CO2, up from 280 parts per million in 1750. So this is a crazy fact. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have never risen above 300 parts per million in the last 2 million years, except for the last 200 years up till now. Okay. So it's really strange. It's very strange what's going on in terms of CO2. In terms of total global surface temperature, the rise from 1850 to 2020 was 1.1 degrees Celsius, of which humans are accountable for 98% of that increase. Okay, so since then, we've actually already changed the climate. We're actually in climate change right now. We've already risen the temperature by a degree and a bit. In terms of rainfall, rainfall over land has increased overall, though there are basically differences there are extreme dry areas and extreme wet areas. So dry areas are getting even drier and wet areas are getting even wetter, and they're getting the brunt of these kind of extreme rainfall events. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Humans are also the main driver of the global retreat in glaciers and sea ice, and an increase in upper ocean temperature and global mean sea level. So actually, to focus on sea level rise was approximately 1.3 millimeters a year in the 1900s, and that's more than tripled today to nearly 4 millimeters a year. So almost every single thing we look at, it has changed. Yeah. And it's directly because of a change in atmospheric CO2 and temperature. Okay. And then the kind of last bit of evidence they have, and they have 30 and 40 years of evidence for it, of working on this, is the global biosphere, which means everywhere in the world where there can be life, has shifted in line with global warming. And basically climate zones have shifted poleward in the north and southern hemisphere, especially on land in the northern hemisphere. And that actually ties in with some stuff we talk about later as well. So how was that? Are you still with me, Andrew?
Yeah. No, I'm listening.
It's good.
For the good part. Waiting for the good part.
Waiting for the positive bits. So one of the biggest key figures that they show is actually they looked at temperature over time, and they made these fantastic models of temperature in the past and right up to now. And as I talked about in the last climate change episode, there's this graph that's pretty wiggly, but it stays around 0 degrees of change. And then right in the last kind of 150 or 200 years, it just goes off the scale. It just shoots off. So they show this, and they show that that's directly because of human influence, and that we've basically warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. And in fact, the last 200 years have been the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years. So again, this is really weird what's going on right now.
Yeah.
And then they kind of show this like second graph where they did something really cool. They modeled what the Earth's temperature would have done over the last 2,000 years if humans didn't change the atmosphere. And it's really cool because the model, well, it's an amalgamation of like thousands of models over 30 years. It just goes again. It's like flat but wiggly at 0 degrees change. Yeah. And then as soon as you put in the human part, it starts trickling up. And then so their model actually is really similar to observed temperature rise. So that's how they can show that their models are really, really good, because they're pretty much bang on with what we actually end up seeing.
Yeah.
So the models are so robust. What's interesting is they also looked into the different kind of like the chemical influences on the atmosphere, like what things humans put into the atmosphere up till today. And by far the most important one is CO2, carbon dioxide. So that is the most important for an increase in temperature. And there's another one called methane, which we talked about in the last episode. And methane, we make a lot less of it, but it's extremely more potent as a greenhouse gas. But something interesting that they actually do is, from breaking down all the different chemicals, they basically showed that there's actually some chemicals, Andrew, that have caused a net cooling in the atmosphere.
No
So
way.
there's things like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. These things they come in the form of aerosols.
Yeah.
In cans and in fridges and stuff like that. Coolant in your car. All of these things actually cause a net drop in temperature. So they're actually fighting against all of the things that are increasing the temperature.
Way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So they're not just saying everything we put into the atmosphere increases the temperature. Some things actually decrease. And you would think that's a good thing, but it's not, because the things that decrease the temperature actually make the air really kind of full of dust and particles and kind of like gloomy. And so that's why you get smog in cities, is because of these sort of aerosol particles, and they kind of catch dust and they keep it on top of a city. And that is basically a health issue. It can be really bad for people's lungs. So like someone could be like, from this, listening to this, they could be like, oh my God, we just chucked, a bunch of aerosols into the atmosphere. Job done.
That was exactly what my plan was about to be. I was right about to ask, can we not just put empty cans and destroy fridges and just shoot that stuff up to go? Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I wish we could, but there's then different... That just causes another whole set of problems. It just makes the atmosphere hard for us to actually breathe then. So it's another issue.
And that would not be good for the ecology of nature.
No, I don't think so.
I'd argue breathing is important.
Yeah, breathing can be.
As a clueless person, that's the height of my knowledge here.
Okay, so moving swiftly on, right, there's another really kind of interesting figure that they made, and they basically broke down the entire land part of the world into these regions, and they broke the world down into these these sextants, these areas, and there's 41 in total, and they looked at in every area, is there an increase, no agreement, or a decrease in things like temperature, rainfall, and drought. And what is really interesting is that they found that if you look at this figure, it's really cool. It shows all of the regions except for 4 say that there's an increase in temperature. So it's just red. The whole world is just red.
No way.
In terms of extreme rainfall, it's most of the northern hemisphere, most of Europe and Russia and Asia get more rainfall. And pretty much the whole southern hemisphere, there's actually not enough data. But I reckon if we were able to get enough data, they would say something opposite. Yeah. And we'll look into the projections and how that kind of informs that. But then in terms of the droughts, they really focus on the Mediterranean and most of Western and Southern Africa and South America have way more droughts now than they did, say, 100 years ago. So these are already happening because of climate change. So, you can kind of question, well, it's not happening to me. Well, yeah, it's not happening to you, but maybe you're in a place that is more mild. These things are kind of happening and are being seen all over the world. So there's just a huge amount of evidence now that we're in a time of where the climate has already changed.
Because that was something that popped up to me earlier when you were saying that this was the first time that they used unequivocally. They were saying, we're sure. Yeah. We're certain. And I suppose the only thing, why now? What changed? The last one of these was what, 5-10 years ago?
It was nearly 10 years ago. The thing is, honestly, and it's in all of science, is that you need to get up into that 99 to 100% probability of something happening before you can say something like it is certain. It is, and I think another term they use is virtually certain.
Yeah.
Other than unequivocal, but they're kind of the same thing. And so until now, they just have been building more and more and more data. And actually the last 10 years of data, because the fact that most of the world has scientists now that are creating more data, this has been one of the most influential changes from the fifth assessment to the sixth one, which is the one that just came out. So that's why they just have way more data, 10 years more, but it's actually like, you know, proportionately maybe 20-30% more data. And so and they've been working, think about it, they've been working on these models and just making them better and better and better every single assessment they do. And they've been doing it since the 80s, pretty much since the 70s or 80s. So that's why.
Yeah, that's cool.
They've been working their butts off. So then we talked about like the current state of where we are with climate change. Now the report kind of moves into their projections of the future. And in order for you to understand some of these things, they've basically kind of like done several projections in different, what they call socio-political pathways. So different scenarios that human society might take kind of in general. So there's kind of like they show on this key graph, it's probably the most important graph in the whole report. They show the projection of CO2 up until 2100. So, you know, several decades away from now. And they give 5 scenarios. And they show where the CO2 levels will be and what the temperature will be by 2100. And the worst case scenario, we go up to, we pump another about 130 gigatons of carbon, which is a billion. It is 130 billion tons more of carbon into the atmosphere. But what that actually means for us is a 3 to 6 degrees warming by 2100. And like 3 degrees is pretty catastrophic. 6 degrees is like, have you seen 2020? Have you seen that crappy movie? It's like, it's hellish, basically. Yeah. It'd be very bad. But that's the worst case scenario, okay? So it's not like the Earth is just going to blow up at 6 degrees. It would be really bad for pretty much all of society. Yeah. But there's actually about 2 scenarios that they give that are actually really good. And both of them drop below net zero emissions by about one drops by about 2060 and the other one drops by about 2080.
Okay.
So, you know, and I think what's important about those is in the best case scenario, the Earth warms by between 0.9 and 1.8 degrees Celsius. And really the government right now, all world leaders are pretty much aiming for between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So there is one scenario there where this is possible. The second one goes a little bit over that, and I think it ends up at, it says it's nearly 2 degrees. So give or take 2 and a bit degrees. So, and then the middle scenario again is, it's still not great. It's 2.5 degrees, nearly 3 degrees, but it's still better. And it's still much better than those other 2 that are like, basically the worst 2 scenarios are just if we go crazy with emissions and we just actually keep increasing our production. So those are probably that's probably the most important figure in the entire document, because it basically shows there are 3 different scenarios out of 5 where the world will be different in the future, but it will be manageable. So I think that's kind of a really hopeful thing for me. That's what I take from this whole report is, you know, we're basically saying if we just keep doing business as usual, very bad things will happen. If we don't, if we actually take some action right now, there's very legitimate ways that we can make things better, you know?
Yeah, and 2060 and 2080 sounds a lot more reasonable than numbers you'd hear before. And like I remember hearing numbers like 10 years ago, maybe hearing, oh, if we go carbon neutral by 2030 or something like that. And I was always a bit like, yeah, that would be great. But how do you do that on a logistical sense? You can't turn the world over.
Is it genuinely actually feasible?
Yeah, but 2060 scale? Or 2080, I feel like, especially with the growth of technology in that time, it would surely get optimized and it would become more and more possible as time goes on. Would that be fair to say?
It would be. And like, the reality, Andrew, is that, you know, we're going to fall somewhere in between all of these.
Yeah.
None of these are going to actualize themselves. None of them are going to actually happen. We're going to fall somewhere, and it's up to us where we land.
Yeah.
And it's cool because it basically says we can land between 0.9 degrees or like 6 or 7. So that's our responsibility. We got this huge range, and now it's up to us to make a difference. So a couple more things I just want to talk about, like, that are really important for people to realize, is that the Earth isn't just going to increase by 6, say, for instance, in that worst case scenario. Or maybe not. Let's go for the kind of best or second best case scenario where the world increased by 2 degrees. The warming will be not uniform everywhere in the world. In fact, pretty much every single model suggests that the north of the northern hemisphere, like up in polar regions and subpolar regions, up near, say, Norway and up near Canada and further north, that will get really damn hot. Really hot. So they think that that's going to actually be twice as hot as the average. So it might be 4 degrees hotter up there. And then in kind of mid-latitudes, temperate regions, it won't be as bad. But that, again, is quite important because that's where one of our most important ice caps is.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same for the Antarctic ice cap right in the south. And so if warming is most intense in those ice caps, then they're going to melt faster.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about what happens when they melt faster. But that's just important for people to know that there will be some places that will actually potentially even cool over the next 100 years. In the middle of the North Atlantic, there's a whole area of the North Atlantic that is cooling right now because of a completely different, weird regional effect of currents. But globally, you know, the whole Earth has increased in temperature, and especially the Arctic region. Yeah. So, and then if we actually kind of relate this to two other things as well, projections of rainfall and of moisture content. So rainfall is kind of like, you can think of extreme rainfall means floods. Extremely low moisture content is drought, right? And they kind of, all of their models suggest that in terms of rainfall, again, the most northern polar regions are going to get the most rain. And so most of Northern Europe, most of northern North America are going to get a serious amount of rain. And another place that might surprise you is actually the entire Sahel region, or the Sahara region, sub-Sahara, which is a desert right now. They actually think that climate change is actually going to potentially benefit them with insane amounts of rain. Now, that could also actually be really bad because it could cause even more flash floods, which are very common there. And because the soil is so compact and thin, it just like hits the soil and goes downhill and causes all sorts of really bad natural disasters. But again, these two together show that like the majority of North America, southern North America, and all of South America, and pretty much Australia, Southeast Asia, they all get really dry. And Southeast Asia is one of the most important places for food production. If you don't have food being produced in Southeast Asia, you cause problems all around the world. So they're really scared that, in particular, because that's a hub of production in terms of agriculture in the world, that will cause problems.
For sure.
So if, you know, the more you warm, the more problems you will create in terms of drought. Okay. And then they also kind of break this down into these, what they call 10-year events. And And it's a really cool example. It's a really cool way of explaining to people how this works. So it's a hypothetical situation that they've turned into to explain these kind of extreme events. But say, for instance, you had an extreme heat wave event that occurred every 10 years in the 1800s. Okay? So anywhere in the world. Okay. Let's just, it could be anywhere. It's a hypothetical situation. Today, it now occurs, because of the climate change that has already happened, one of those heat waves occurs 3 times every 10 years. Okay?
Okay.
If the Earth increases its temperature by 2 degrees, these 10-year events will happen 5 to 6 times every 10 years.
No way.
And if the Earth increases its average temperature by 4 degrees, you will have one of these 10-year events once a year. So you have to think about it this way. It's like climate change doesn't happen as averages. It happens as extremes.
Yeah.
So
that
will...
is unpleasant.
It will be, and it could get really, really bad. And they kind of give similar examples of extreme flooding events and extreme drought events as well. So, the take home here is that climate change won't just be, it's a bit more balmy here, and in some places, like in Ireland, for example, we're in a temperate climate, or it's very mild winters and kind of cool summers. And it's not just going to be like, it's, now we have great summers. It's like we will actually have extreme rainfall events and flooding, and then we'll get extreme drought events and water shortages. So it'll be felt in the extremes, not in the average, is what I'm trying to say. Another really kind of important thing, and again, this is, they said they had to mention this because if policymakers don't make a move because of anything else, this will get them to move. The kind of page starts with human activities affect all the major climate system components, with some responding over decades and others over centuries. And they give examples of temperature, which we've already talked about. They talk about sea ice cover in the Arctic in September. And in some of the scenarios, there won't be any sea ice in September. Some of the worst scenarios in terms of the ocean becoming too acidic, especially in the worst 2 cases that happens. And then the biggest hitter right now is sea level, and their models for the higher projections couldn't say that a rise of 15 meters by 2300 wouldn't happen. So when you push the increase of Earth's temperature on by a couple hundred years, they couldn't rule out that the Earth's ocean temperature, sea level would rise by up to 15 meters. And that is because of the chance that if we just keep pumping more and more and more carbon into the atmosphere, and we get up to 5, 6, 7 degrees of an increase, that could potentially cause the Arctic and the Antarctic ice caps to melt.
Yeah.
And if they melt, you get all of that water that is frozen solid is now liquid and in the oceans. And I just couldn't even imagine, again, 15 meters increase. It again sounds like doomsday. But that is, again, we have to add, the reason they're putting this in here is they're basically saying, guys, if we do nothing, and if we actually do worse in the future, we can see something like that really bad happening. Yeah. So it's not to scare people, but it's just to be like, look, there is a likelihood of these things happening if we do nothing and if we just keep getting worse. So we're nearly actually at the end of the report. I just kind of wanted to talk about this thing called the thing I just talked about there, where 15 meter rise in sea level by 2300. That's called a low likelihood outcome. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is just what they had to say about these things that are like, they're very low likelihood, but we still can't rule them out.
Yeah.
If we do very, very bad. So things like ice sheet collapse, abrupt ocean circulation changes, some compound extreme events. Compound extreme events are like having a drought and then a forest fire.
What?
So you have a terrible drought, and then you actually have another natural disaster right after. And so 2 or more natural disasters at the same time is called a compound extreme event. So they actually in the report go into detail about like what events might happen together, and those compound events will be more frequent. So again, big no. Yeah. But they basically can't rule them out, and they are part of the whole risk assessment of this whole report, that you need to put them in because, yeah, you can't rule them out. They need to be there. So, if that's not a reason to reduce our emissions, then I don't know what is. The last page of the report talks about something really interesting, and it's just called like our remaining carbon budget.
Yeah.
And they figured out like how much carbon we've made since 1850. And they're like, okay, this is how much we've made. So how much can we make before we reach certain thresholds of temperature? And so they just do it in this cute little table. It's like kind of, I was just saying to some of my family like yesterday, I was like, they need to like cover this in like red ink and be like, look at this is so important. Because it's like mind boggling. But the kind of highest chance of us reaching 1.5 degrees is that we only have 300 gigatons of carbon left. Let me check my notes, because I actually did some math on what that actually means in terms of like how many years we have left at our current rate of carbon production.
Mm-hmm.
So 300 gigatons before we reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have 8.5 years at our current production.
8.5
of CO2. So that's
8.5.
8.5 years. So that's based on our current production of, and the figure I got for that was 35 gigatons of carbon. So if that was wrong, because it could well have been, I got it from Our World in Data, but it could have been wrong. So let me know if it is, and we can change that figure. But it's kind of like I wanted to do just like scribbly calculations, tabletop calculations.
Yeah.
And I got 8.5 years average. And then before 2 degrees, we have about 900 gigatons, or 25.5 years. Right. Okay. So 25.5 years it's around 2050, 2045 or something like that. Right. So so that's why people are talking about 2 degrees by 2050, because it's actually in line with our kind of current production.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think that's maybe the most important thing of this whole report. The future projection is maybe the second most, or if not the most, but this is kind of for policymakers. I'm pretty sure this is one of the last pages on the report. It's just like, right, this is actually what you really need to look at. This is how much we have left. This is what we have to work with. So that's pretty much it for the report, Andrew. Are you okay?
Where's the good part, Aidan?
Where's the good part?
You had like one thing that I was like, oh, that's the optimistic, and it was just like, oh God, it's so much more friendly to live in fantasy land and pretend times. But what's really important about what you were saying there is that this is the information being communicated to world leaders right now. World leaders are hearing all of this, aren't they?
Yeah, so this is literally what they got back in August, and they're in COP26 delegating what the hell they're going to do right now.
Yeah.
Right up until, I think it's going on for about another week. And this is really important because they all know this now, that we have about 25 and a half years before we go over that limit. And each country, I guess, gets its chance to speak to the world and to say how climate change is affecting them. And the thing that I talked about before, that whole first half of the report saying that climate change has already affected us. Yeah. That 1 degree of change actually turns up again in the form of these extreme events that have already affected people. And so like in island nations, in the South Pacific, places like Fiji, are getting battered by storms, and sea level rise is already kind of forcing some of the very small islands to they have to evacuate the islands. They're just getting swept away. So this is already happening, and I think the most optimistic thing is coming from the COP. Places I listened to Joe Biden's speech, and he's gung ho, he's totally on with the picture and wants to do as much as he can, and I hope that he sticks to it. But having one of the most powerful countries in the world on your side is not a bad thing. Pretty much all of the major nations in the world have already agreed that drastic action needs to be taken. And I guess the amount of action that needs to be taken by each country and what they do will be completely different. Yeah. But it is almost always, I think the biggest effects will happen to the first world, in terms of how we do things. And it might mean that things might get slightly more expensive or more convoluted to get something, but it'll just mean that we do it in a way more sustainable way, in a way that isn't pumping a bunch of carbon into the atmosphere.
For sure, yeah. I think maybe I'm mixing things up here, but I think it will also have a big effect on third world countries in how they build their economies and all of that, because obviously first world countries got rich by burning carbon and burning a lot of carbon, and third world countries would kind of look at that and develop their economy in a similar way. Yeah. But now third world nations are caught between a rock and a hard place, where to develop their economy they can't take that route. I know. Because if they take that route, they are contributing to something that will come back to bite them harder. And if they don't take that route, they can't bring more wealth into their country.
Yeah, so actually that's a really good point, because it's something that I just forgot to mention there. You're talking about financial aid, and that is really what a lot of the world nations are talking about right now. They're like, right, how much money do we have to give to the third world? We need to up it. We need to up it by, I think, the head of COP26, he's actually a financial advisor. I think that's what his background is in. And so he talks about it in terms of trillions. He says trillions is what we're going to need to give to developing nations, so that they can actually they can kind of skip past the Industrial Revolution. Because Europe did it. America did it. We did a full-on Industrial Revolution, and we're still doing it. And countries like India and China now are deep in the middle of their Industrial Revolution. So it's very difficult for them right now, because they are some of the biggest polluters other than, America and the United States and Europe. But that, I think that is one of the best things that is going to come out of COP26. Not only is there going to be an entire update of our targets, because the Paris Agreement back in 2015 was that, I think it was a target of, it was a certain level by 2050, and it's simply not enough actually. So they have to up their commitments by quite a drastic amount, and they will. And so, very cool. I mean, from an Irish perspective, which I think is kind of interesting because we are a first world nation, but we actually have a massive primary and secondary sector. Like, we've a massive agriculture sector. And agriculture is one of the things that is going to be one of Ireland's biggest issues to tackle. Yeah. Because some of the reports I've seen that have been like, look, we're going to have to think about or try and find a way to reduce our agricultural production by about 20%. And what that actually means is it's a huge problem for, so many millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people at least in Ireland, that are in agriculture and all of the industries that come with it. And so I actually think in terms of Irish intervention and mitigation of climate change is going to be in the form of like subsidies for agriculture. And so, for instance, you might have this huge industrial agricultural business. And the Irish government will give them a certain amount of money to actually reduce their production. So that's what it's going to have to turn into. It's going to, and they're going to be like, wait, what? You want to give us money so that we just make less? And you're going to be like, yes, because if you give them nothing, they just lose money. And for some very large and very small businesses, that can completely cripple them. Because they are just set up to make X amount of stuff. So that's what we're going to have to do in an Irish context. It's
interesting. The game's changed. The game has changed.
It has. Yeah. And I was just thinking there as well that like there's going to be new jobs coming out as well in the form of like green energy is going to just explode. Yeah. Electric cars and everything that's to do with green is going to get huge. And you're going to have a whole new sector of like climate change consultants. Yeah. So you're going to get this person who like comes into your business and is like, right, this is what you need to do to adapt to climate change in your country. It just sounds crazy. It just like, 10, 20 years ago, people would laugh at you saying that.
Of course.
But now it's just, it couldn't be more normal. And that's actually made me really happy. In the news in the news and everything, people are like, okay, all right, you've talked about it enough. You've talked a lot, and we've heard you for so long that we're actually starting to believe you now. Or at least the majority of people are, and so now people are kind of okay to move.
That's so funny.
They're okay
somewhere
to act.
Somewhere Al Gore smiled and just went, finally.
Exactly, like Al Gore, yeah. Happy guy. Well done, dude. Yeah. He's been fighting the fight for very much longer time than I have.
Well, that was great. And it's really interesting to hear and to actually understand in layman's terms what they're hearing, what they're being advised, and also to be aware when they don't follow said advice, so we know what's going on. I think that's also very important to be informed for, again, when we're coming to a stage of voting for people. I'd much prefer to be in a situation where I have heard what they've been told as opposed to what they're saying they're going to do and see if it matches. So this has been really enlightening. Thank you so much, Aidan. Thanks for giving us all a bit of cop on.
Thank you very much. Everyone, just keep hanging there and just see what the government's doing over the next couple of years. Hopefully they do good things, and if not, we'll have something to say about it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the 5-year review that we start doing for these things.
Yeah. We're like, oh no, or yes.
Yeah. And we'll see you then.